My name is Jim Eagleman. I'm a retired DNR naturalist, worked here in a Turkey Run State Park for a career of about 40 years. 40 years, I think, in 1 month. And it's from that experience that Jody asked me to share some of those stories of my job here at Indiana's largest state park. I'd be happy to do that, but also to bring in some of the park history that may be of interest to you. It's the largest state park, just shy of 16,000 acres. I better be sure of my facts today. The retired property manager is sitting in the back. And he can check me on these facts. Shy of 16,000 acres, Doug, right? Or are we over that? There you go. Heard it from the man himself. I understand your agenda includes some more travel through the park. You'll get a chance to drive these hills of Brown. The hills of Brown go up and down, and you'll notice it tomorrow when the extra horsepower kicks in of your car. But when you walk these hills, it's an entirely different experience. And this rugged southern Indiana hill country has a lot to do with the settlement and the beginning of the county's art colony here in Nashville. You may have heard of that. And so I'll try to weave in the story of the settlement years, and at the end there, a short time, maybe about my tenure here, and some of the challenges and accomplishments that I enjoyed as the park naturalist. You've heard of Brown County State Park, now you're here, and it's one of Indiana's great tourist attractions. The town of Nashville is very much aware of that, and over the years, with Doug's help and my staff, we worked together with the Convention and Visitors Bureau to capitalize on the tourism industry coming into Nashville for the art and the nature and the scenic beauty with festivals here at the park. So we worked with local groups as best we could to promote both the park and the community. That was one of the many assigned duties that I had as a naturalist, to work with public relations as best we could to encourage tourism, and through the conservation message of our interpretive program, bring what we hoped was a certain amount of awareness to our visitor. And when you've got 16,000 acres of your backyard like we did, it created wonderful opportunities to get out and bird and botanize and learn about this park. When I was at Turkey Run State Park as a greenhorn naturalist just starting out, I could sense right away that my knowledge of natural history was pretty limited. I'm sure you felt that yourself, right? As master naturalists, you think, okay, I know it all, right? Probably not. And that was certainly my feeling when I started at Turkey Run. So within a year or so, I knew that DePaul University down the road offered a botany program, and I always loved plants. So I got enrolled on my days off to study botany at DePaul for a master's degree, and learned real soon that I didn't know very much about plants. But at Turkey Run, with glacial history being prominent, we learned quite quickly how plants adapted to that changing environment since the Pleistocene. And it was just really interesting for me to sit in class again. Having gotten out of school in the 70s, I was back in school to learn more on what I could. And my advisor said at one point, you'll have to crank out a thesis. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. I have to do a report. Well, it was more than a report. It was a pretty extensive historical literature search on this park, because by then I had transferred from Turkey Run to here and wanted to know a little bit more about this forest. And like you'll notice tomorrow, when you drive these roads and pass these vistas, we've always called them our trademark of Brown County State Park, these wonderful views, $100 million views as we call them, 8 and 10 and 11 and 15 miles to the horizon. It always was of interest to me, how did this timber change? Because from what I could tell, and you'll see it tomorrow yourselves, This timber is young. Most of the trees are about this size, maybe a little bit bigger. Now with the windstorm, some of the big ones went down. But from our tally of increment boring, we know that there probably isn't too many trees in this park that are over 100 years old. That's a pretty good yardstick to go by, 100-year-old forest. So my question was, where did the timber go if it was only 100 years old? Who took it? What happened to it? Who was it that cut it? Why did they cut it? And I mentioned these things to my advisor, and he goes, there's your thesis. And so I thought, okay, well, that was easy. Now I start to do the research at the Archives Library in Indianapolis and all the Department of Conservation records that they had kept over the years before it was a DNR. And I was able to learn a little bit about the history of this place. And it's an interesting history when you think of Indiana in its early days, with about 1820, the date being given the time for settlement in the southern half. If you look at an early map of Indiana in 1820, a lot of the counties along the Ohio River were already settled. But the interior part of the southern section was still wilderness. So those incoming settlers came down the Ohio and eventually moved their way over rugged terrain, as you can imagine, through thick forests, virgin timber, old-growth forests, to establish farms or whatever communities they wanted along the way as they moved from the southeast to the northwest here in the Midwest. So that gave me an idea of how land was settled from the south to the middle part of the state. And by 1820, settlement had already started. In fact, some of the more enterprising people had already arrived and set up what they hoped would be profitable businesses. And one was due to a man by the name of Jackson, and he popularized the first business called the Jackson Salt Works. And he must have found that with water from Salt Creek by the covered bridge entrance that you crossed over, that when he left water in a bucket, it would evaporate, but in the residue in the bottom of the bucket was salt. Well, they knew we needed salt for preservation of game and meat and such, so that was the first commercial business to be ready for the settlers coming in who hunted and needed food to preserve their food through the use of salt. So the Jackson Salt Works is documented as one of our first commercial businesses. So from the early 1800s, then through the middle part of the century, settlement took place here and there as settlers found land for equitable sale through the efforts of the General Land Office surveyors. These were federal employees that first came through and documented 40-acre tracts with witness trees. And they purposely blaze a tree on the corner of a 40-acre tract. And they knew that if they took down, or if they marked with a blaze mark on an old tree, that would be one of the first ones cut. And so there went the discrepancy, or your boundary line. So they purposely chose young trees to mark, and mark down on tallies and field survey sheets the types of trees that they were seeing: oak, hickory, sugar maple, and sassafras, pin oak, and dogwoods and such. So these trees were categorized, cataloged in those first General Land Office survey records. So it's from those archival records we know that the forest of today is very much like it was originally. It's just been cut and regrown back to that similar variety of hardwoods. So the hardwood trees were known later to be a landmark and a beautiful feature, but in the early days, I'm sure it was quite an obstacle. And if you're a farmer coming in to make the best living for you and your family, those trees were in the way. So over time, tremendous quantities of timber were cut off this land, to where we have no virgin timber in the park or in the county. It's all young, and you'll see that as you drive tomorrow. Small trees making up the cover of these rugged lands. When you cut timber, you expose these thin soils. They're acid-loving soils created from rotting oak leaf litter, changing the soil chemistry to acidic. And in some cases, some of the maps show on the early park records a lime kiln ridge starting from the fire tower on back towards the southern part of the park. A lime kiln ridge. Lime, alkaline is basic and the opposite of acidic. So when settlers moved in, they found most of the soil was acidic once they got through a very thin limestone cap, as it's called. The cap was thin limestone that they found through trial and error, I'm sure, that if you fired it under tremendous heat in a kiln, like a beehive kiln, or sometimes they were buried kilns, if it was fired under heat, it turned into powder. Lime powder poured over acidic soils didn't make you a great gardener, but it made better crop chances than what you had if you didn't have the lime. So the lime kiln was the first indication that the lime of Monroe County, with tremendous outcroppings of limestone there, you know, limestone, Bedford, Indiana is world known. It's found throughout the world. The Kremlin in Moscow is made out of Indiana limestone, just a half hour from here. And yet we have nothing but sandstone as our bedrock. It's awfully porous, it's very brittle, and it's terrible to farm. And when you expose it by removing the timber crop, you can tell by the rains recently, you know what happens to these thin soils on the hillside. That's all repeat. It'll slow down, go downhill, right? Do you understand that part? You're a naturalist, do you understand that? So the soils were very precariously put into production, and it just was not very good. We had very few businesses thriving. Maybe some fruit trees were grown commercially. Some of the timber then in later years was sold to supplement this meager income of the farmer. But for the most part, he hung on in a very destitute lifestyle. Simultaneous to the settling was the establishment in later 1800s, the early 1900s, of the Nashville's artist colony. So we've often remarked about the dichotomy that existed between the farmers hanging on, and then in came the fairly well-to-do artists from all over the world to paint Brown County's beautiful hills in spring or summer, or in fall and winter scenes became the site, or these themes became the site of these painters that came in from all over the world, Chicago, also Cincinnati, and Louisville, and New York City. And they'd come here and spend the summer and paint. Well, this very different lifestyle than what the farmer was looking at created some interesting stories, and they're all documented in some of the newspapers. The farmers were hanging on and wondered why a painter could set up an easel out in the fields and paint all day. There was work to be done. And how can you spend your time painting if you're a worker of the land? Well, they weren't. They were well-to-do and sold their paintings throughout the world. So there was a rather bohemian-esque party life documented by the painters, and they were well known for spending money in rooming houses in town or renting a home for the summer and having pretty silly parties that lasted into the wee hours. And that dichotomy, interestingly enough, some will argue, exists today. We have the art colony, a historic art colony going on, and with its popularity as a beautiful site, people have come here to buy land and put their vacation home up on top of a beautiful ridge with $1 million view. Right down the road, there may be a trailer barely hanging on the hillside. We still have that income disparity, and the dichotomy still exists. But believe it or not, we all get along. And it's it's a great place to be. Settlement then took place from the late 1800s into the early 20s. Brown County was established as a state park in 1929. Prior to that, it was a game farm. We heard from the turkey talk that sportsmen's dollars are a tremendous help to securing lands. And it was through the use of sportsmen's dollars supporting the game farm of early Brown County's history that helped get the park going. In the early days, game farms were nothing more than places set aside to reintroduce species of wildlife that had over time been driven out, extirpated, and they were now release sites to reintroduce animals. The Brown County Game Farm was one of the release sites for deer as well as game birds. And when you pass the fire tower tomorrow on your drive, that big field by the fire towers where game bird pens were built. And they reared grouse and turkey and quail and Hungarian partridge and pheasant in these pens to release them. An interesting sidelight, I'm going to tell you a story about a mentor of mine. If you haven't heard of this guy, you will. If you haven't heard of him in your readings, in your studies, in your leisure reading, you will. His name is Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold came through southern Indiana, I suspect, although it's never been proven, but he would have had to have talked to these game farm managers as he was on his Midwestern tour of 11 Midwestern states, the purpose of which was to meet with landowners, range farming organizations, biologists, universities. His purpose was to learn what the game populations were, because before he became a professor of the first game department at the University of Wisconsin, he was employed by SAMI, the Sports Ammunition and Munitions Manufacturing Institute, SAMMI, out of Madison, Wisconsin. They hired Leopold as a forester. Out west, he came back to the Midwest, to Madison, to live, and his first job was to work for this ammunitions company. And their assignment to him on these several summers was for Aldo to go through these states, checking with them on what farmers and hunters were hunting, and what size cartridge or ammunition did you need to shoot a pheasant, or a bunny rabbit, or a quail, or a grouse. It was a toss-up until they were able to define the absolute proper munitions for the game that were being hunted. So Leopold, on his trip through the Midwest, met with these different people, and his route is traced through southern Indiana on one of the maps I saw. So my guess is Aldo Leopold, the great game biologist, author, and wonderful scientist, must have set foot in Brown County, Indiana, and as a student of his for many years, it just gives me goosebumps. Wonderful thing to think of Aldo Leopold here at Brown County talking to game farm managers. You probably ask them, what are you finding? And he says, you know, when you release game birds, they die. They don't do well. You can't rear game birds in captivity and have them develop a certain woods smarts, so to speak, and survive. So there's tremendous mortality from these releasings, and Leopold knew this and documented it in his big, thick book that we studied in college, Game Management. It's a monster thing that we had to read through, and he's documenting these trial and error attempts by game managers at the time on what they were finding, and what worked and what didn't. And I had the many readings assigned to me in school, and then to know that he came here, it's just a thrill. So Brown County Game Farm was the initial start of Brown County State Park. The initial part of the park was up here around the lodge, and it stopped by the fire towers, a big field. And so acreage from that part of the park on down to the highway was the original part of Brown County State Park, and the acreage past the fire tower was game farmland. So the two properties existed side by side for many years until 1940, when the deed transfer took place in the Department of Conservation between what was then the Division of Lands, Parks, and Waters and the Division of Fish and Game. Names have changed, but back when then would be the start, the official start of Brown County State Park, where game was the main point of existence. And in the meantime, the artists said to certain conservation leaders at the time, many of them local, hey, you know, you've got a beautiful place there with the recovering forest from the timber removal of earlier years and the young brushy stage coming back. It makes for great wildlife habitat, but it makes for the painter wonderful scenes to paint. And so the commissioners at the time approached leaders in Indianapolis and said, we'd like to make it a park. And the first director, you may know, Richard Lieber, it turns out wasn't too interested, but they got some headway, the local commissioners did, by getting sent down the hall, the story goes, from Lieber's office to the first Fish and Wildlife Director. His name was George Manfeld. And Manfeld was a little bit open to the idea of a game farm and buying up land that was abandoned, where people moved on after their destructive manner. He would look for these properties to make into game farms. And they were in their heyday through the 30s and 40s, and by the late 40s, Fish and Wildlife properties became the title of these original game farms. The Brown County State Park started out that way as a game farm. And little maybe do our sportsmen know that, but it was through their dollars and support that it started that way. I'm going to need some water. Could somebody bring me some? Thanks, Doug. To say my career here at Brown County was a piece of cake is a little bit of a mislead. It was challenging for a young guy coming in. I started at Turkey Run, as I told you, in my late 20s, and pretty soon after that we were married. My wife Kay and I have 3 boys, and in the time that we've lived here, we've sent them through college, we've built a home, and we've dropped anchor in Brown County. It's a wonderful place to be, and I've had a great time here. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the things I ran into, or was challenged by, or supervised by this guy. Doug would often give me evaluations, yearly ones, and he'd say, what are you doing? And I'd give him a list. And he said, oh, you're doing that and that and that. I wonder who did that. So I covered my butt on many occasions by showing up and doing a little bit more than what was expected, which was what you do when you love the work. When I started as a biologist in a fish and wildlife degree program at Western Illinois University, I was as green as they came. I didn't know squat. We had a field station that the university owned, and that was where I kind of cut my teeth on botany and plants and mammals and insects. And I thought, if you can get a job studying this stuff, you get an income, this is for me. My dad had different ideas. He was a county vet and wanted me to go to vet school. And I started out in an animal science degree program at Western, but it wasn't for me. I studied poultry science and dairy science and beef science, and I found that for the most part, these curricula deal with bigger production, more eggs, more milk, more beef, more pork. And it had to do with the nutrition you give of the animal. Some of you are farmers, you know this. Well, that was great for the farming community, and the guys that I knew were serious about wanting to return to the farm. But I grew up on a farm, and I saw all the work that it took. I grew up on a sheep farm in southeast Pennsylvania. My dad, being the vet, was also a hobbyist sheep farmer. And when time came to play football or basketball, I had to go to the farm and work. So I grew up in that environment, and I thought it's more custodial and stewardship work than it is my passion. So I loved animals, and I started to see that my love of wild animals was intriguing, because how do they live without man's help, mankind's help? How do animals live without us tending after them? We don't feed them, we don't give them water, we don't nourish them when they're giving birth. You know, this was intriguing to me, so I left the curriculum of animal science one Thanksgiving vacation I'll never forget. I told my dad I was going to change majors, and he says, well, yeah, that's okay, you need a passion. I use the word passion. And he told me that from then on, the funding would stop. So I got busy and got a job working on an asphalt paving crew that summer. Made enough to pay tuition. So coming here with a degree in animal nutrition as a background, and then learning more about wild animal nutrition gave me an idea of what we could do in the way of research at this property. And luckily, over time, graduate students would show up in my office. And boy, that was a treat when you can plug graduate students into programs that you're curious about, but you've never had the time or the expertise to delve into these mysteries. You put them to work. And so we did that several times with plant studies, nutrition studies, insect studies, and shrews. You know shrews, right? Little itty bitty mouse creatures. They're insect eaters. They're not rodents. But shrews ended up being an indicator species for us, interestingly enough. An indicator species tells you that you're either doing something right or not. And within the first few years, our records indicated that we had 5 different shrews live on Brown County's precipitous hills, from the dry ridge tops to the moist bottoms. 5 different shrews: southeastern, smoky, masked, short-tailed, and pygmy. Pygmy shrews are about as big as your little finger, with a tail about as long. That shrew is about like that. And it's the second smallest mammal in the world. The second smallest mammal in the world, here in Brown County, Indiana. Again, goosebumps. So we put the students to work trapping shrews, because simultaneous to wanting to know about them as insect eaters, the deer problem was starting to rise. Do you remember anything about a Brown County State Park deer problem back in the 90s? Nod your heads, you do. You read about it. It happened here. Well, when you set a precedent-setting decision of hunting deer in a protected state park, all sorts of things hit the fan. And that was another challenge for me, to be involved in the deer task force that looked at how are we going to manage many, many, many deer. What do you do? Well, we had 8 ways of looking at it. You know what won out: the use of the public hunter, despite sterilization and relocation and introduction of predators and fencing and all sorts of other options that we looked at. But simultaneous to the deer rising in numbers was the shrew study going on that we were able to use and take to the Natural Resources Commission as an example of where one species is impacted by another species. The deer, you've heard of the term keystone species. The deer is a keystone species. It interferes or affects all the other animals with which it coexists. And so by the second year of the shrew study, we went from 5 shrews to 4. The third year down to 2. And after we studied shrews for a couple years, we had 1 remaining shrew, the biggest one, the short-tailed. And so where are these things going? Well, shrews are insect eaters, and you think, well, it's the plants that are being affected. The deer are eating the plants. The insects live on the plants. So you start to see these concentric rings of interference, correct? Right? Things are related. Nothing new to you. Things are related. There are relationships that exist in nature, aren't there? And so here was an example of a shrew. Who cares about shrews? You would hear people say. Well, a shrew belongs here just like the deer. And so we were able to use the deer, or use the shrew, as an indicator species to say things are not in balance, and there's interruptions, and ecologic disturbance is why we should knock down deer. We weren't out to sell more hunting licenses. We could care less about the hunter having more opportunities to hunt deer in state parks. That was certainly not a motive. The ecologic disturbance was what set us out using sound science. You heard the turkey guy talk about using science. It's what gears and regulates all decision making, or should, in natural resources management. So we did that, brought the shrew study to light, showed the disturbance. One more reason why, Mr. Legislator, we have to hunt deer. Mr. State Park Director, this is imperative. We got some people very cooperative, others that weren't left, and you had to be patient because the people that didn't like the idea left. And when a new guy came on board, I got another opportunity to plead my case here. And over time, with patience and convictions, you get your point across. And so in the early 90s, we were able to have the first ever Indiana State Park deer hunt. 600 hunters crammed into this auditorium, learning how to go about hunting deer, where to drag it, where the check stations were, and where the extra meat went. The Gleaners Food Mart in Indianapolis was able to take a lot of our meat off our hands. They did a lot with canned goods, but when they got venison, it was a celebration. So that was a great opportunity for me to see something firsthand, up close and personal, as they say. And when I retired, the director that gave me a hard time wrote me a nice letter and said, pardon me, thanks for sticking strong to your convictions. I thought, there you go. That's what it takes. What do you feel like? What drives you? And every one of you that's gone through this class probably has convictions. You probably have a strong feeling for whatever got you into this in the first place. And use that, I hope not selfishly, that you don't go out now keep all this training and certification to yourself, but apply it in a volunteer capacity. Or maybe some of you are destined for full-time or part-time work. But pick a natural area, state park, nature conservancy property, fish and wildlife area, state forest, municipal, city parks, land trusts. Pick an agency, and my guess is they're looking for people that can help them put on a special event, maybe a festival, wildflower day, insect day, pond appreciation day, arbor day, whatever. And here you are with your little certificate thinking, hey, you know what? I know more than I used to. And I can apply my talents in this very productive manner, because let's face it, we ain't getting any more nature, and it's getting used and abused.